The war that ravaged Europe and most of the Western world for almost 6 years was about to come to an end. Tanks and planes from the Russian army had crossed the river Elbe in the early morning hours and were beginning their unstoppable onslaught on the Nazi capital of Berlin. On May the 6th of that same year, the Nazi Empire, the Reich that would last 1,000 years and shame even that of Charlemagne, came to an abrupt and violent end. The war in Europe was over, and the war in the Pacific would end in a few short months. But all was not well, for from the ashes of the Nazi Empire would emerge a far more dangerous power, one similarly bent on the subjugation of Western nations and freedom. The Soviet Union was now ready to take its place on the world stage. To combat the menacing specter of an expansionist and communist Russia, the nations of the West bound together with one another to form an alliance that would ensure the fate of millions and be the sole vanguard against the forces of the Soviet Union. That alliance would be called NATO, a revolutionary alliance.
Shortly before the offensive on Berlin, the Allied leadership had met in Yalta in Russia to discuss the possible outlook for post-war Europe. It was decided by all attending, including Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, that the former Nazi satellite states were to hold open elections to determine new democratic regimes. In nations liberated by American and British armies, the transition went relatively smoothly. Moderate democratic governments were re-elected in France, Italy, Denmark, and Scandinavia. Those liberated by the Red Army were less fortunate. One after one, Soviet-backed communist regimes were installed in all of the nations in Eastern Europe. Communist Russia was growing restless and determined to expand its newfound power and influence. Something had to be done. As early as 1947, U.S. diplomats and envoys, along with those in Western Europe, began to formulate the idea of a transatlantic alliance to check the Soviet Union. In March of 1948, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands entered into a treaty of mutual self-defense and cooperation established by the newly formed United Nations. The pact convinced a previously hesitant United States Congress to concede to the establishment of a mutual defense pact with Europe. On the 11th of June, 1948, the so-called Vandenberg Resolution passed in Congress and affirmed the desire of the United States for such an alliance. On April 4, 1949, a formal alliance was signed in Washington to provide for mutual defense against Soviet and communist antagonism and aggression. While alliances had been forged by nations countless times in the past, none had been like the NATO alliance. It was an alliance of not just Europe and the United States, but of the whole Western culture and political establishment. An alliance formed in reaction to the antithesis of everything Western, communism. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was born.
The treaty, as it was signed in 1949, was between 2 North American nations and 10 European nations: the United States, Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. It was, in the true sense of the word, revolutionary. This alliance of nations was indeed formidable, and with the inclusion of the United States military, which boasted some of the most advanced vehicles, ordnance, and equipment of its day, and a numerically substantial army, NATO forces could at least equal, if not exceed, the military prowess of their Soviet opponents. The initial situation in Europe following the signing of the treaty, however, was anything but fortunate for the alliance. The Soviets had managed in a few short years to amass an astounding 35 battle-ready divisions throughout their eastern satellite states. The allies of NATO could barely muster 12. Initially, the alliance was militarily equal to the Soviets. However, they were now in a very dangerous tactical position. That would all change on September the 23rd, 1949.
On that day, the world received a shocking announcement from the Soviet Union. In a remote part of the Siberian wilderness, the Red Army had detonated the first atomic weapon developed by the USSR. Prior to this development, any conventional military shortcoming by NATO in Europe was overshadowed by the knowledge that the United States, and only the United States, possesses a weapon that could send the massive Soviet military into oblivion. That tremendous advantage possessed by NATO forces was rendered moot with the revelation that the Soviets too had the bomb. NATO now had to make a major overhaul to their current defense strategies if they were to have any hope of stopping an onslaught by the forces of Communist Russia.
The front line for this new battleground in large part was divided Germany. The nation had been split after the war, communist on the east and capitalist on the west. This is where the largest assortment of men and material would be concentrated, and it was here that the theoretical war between East and West would begin and end in the so-called Central Front.
The need to build up a sizable defense of Europe was accentuated in the early 1950s when the Soviet-backed armies of North Korea swarmed over the 38th parallel into Western Allied South Korea.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard. More than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack.
To many politicians and analysts, this was a clear indication that the Soviets would not hesitate to use military force to crush any and all things Western. As war raged in the Korean Peninsula, preparations for war were being made in Western Europe. To bolster their defense against the communist assault on Europe, NATO took the controversial step of rearming West Germany, a nation whom only 5 years ago they were at war with. Most of the NATO powers, a recalcitrant France the exception, agreed that such measures were necessary to effectively battle the Soviets. In 1952, West Germany became an independent nation. On May 5, 1955, West Germany joined NATO. The Soviet response was swift and radical. A communist counterpart to NATO, known as the Warsaw Pact, was created. Soviet forces along the German border were now augmented by the forces of the Soviet Union's satellite countries. Alongside the conventional buildup of NATO forces, there was also a massive buildup of nuclear arms. Nuclear bombers that could drop their payloads over Moscow now became staples of every military base from Bonn to Boston.
As West Germany was the central front against the Russians, military participation by the Germans was a necessity. While initial plans for a rearmament were met with skepticism and fear within Germany of a resurrection of its old militaristic ways, by the 1960s the German army had developed into a highly effective and motivated fighting force against a possible Soviet assault. Soon, the German army was the largest deployed on the Central Front. The 70s and 80s were tense times for both NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The two powers nearly came to nuclear blows again during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, mainly between NATO-backed Israel and the Warsaw-backed Egypt. In Europe, while technology and equipment may have undergone radical changes, the general military and political climate had remained pretty much unchanged from that of the early 50s. Two massive multinational armies still conducted exercises and prepared for a hypothetical war that would pit old enemies east and west against each other in a titanic struggle across war-torn Europe. That would effectively mean the end of both antithetical civilizations.
That would all change in December of 1991, when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact crumbled under its own dead weight and passed into the pages of history. Almost overnight, the forces of NATO were left without their enemy of almost 50 years, and it seemed as though the alliance had outlived its purpose. But NATO was not through, and it began to rapidly reform itself to cope with the struggles of the 21st century. The breakup of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe was carried out in a generally peaceful fashion. Former Eastern Bloc nations shed their communist ideologies and embraced the policies of the West. The volatile region of the Balkans, however, exploded into violence and ethnic bloodshed. NATO, whose job it was to ensure the security and defense of Europe, went from preparing to war to maintaining peace. In 1995, 60,000 NATO troops were deployed to Bosnia and Herzegovina after nearly 600,000 people had been killed in a brutal war fought along ethnic and religious lines. In 1999, NATO forces also took part in the peacekeeping operations in the former Yugoslavian province of Kosovo. NATO also extended its hand of friendship and membership to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic in 1997 at a conference in Madrid. At the same time, the alliance strengthened its ties with the Soviet Union's heir, the Democratic Russian Federation. A permanent Russian ambassador now partakes in weekly meetings at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. NATO seemed to be adjusting well to the qualitatively more peaceful post-Cold War climate. The alliance, though, would be forced into a wartime mindset on September 11, 2001, when 3 airplanes piloted by Islamic militants slammed into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing over 3,500 people. For the first time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter, stating that since one of its member nations had been attacked, all NATO nations had been struck at. NATO forces took part in the air and ground war in Afghanistan and will most likely play a decisive role in the coming campaigns to root out terrorism.
The end of the Second World War ushered in a new war, one fraught with mistrust, fear, and shrouded in the looming shadow of an atomic apocalypse. The Cold War was merely a continuation of the age-old struggle between East and West, democracy and oppression, good and evil. But the circumstances of the 20th century dictated that there be a revolutionary alliance of the West to fight this struggle. NATO was the unification of radically different nations, peoples, and cultures, created to defend their freedom and their very existence from communism. NATO was a reaction on a massive scale to the atmosphere of the Cold War, and against all odds, NATO managed to survive that war and reform itself into the organization it is today, as important to the West and the world as it was nearly 50 years ago. NATO was the first, the last, and the best line of defense against all forces that seek to undermine the freedoms and liberties of all people in the West.